welcome back to another Photoshop tutorial. We've got a giant walking through a river, some birds flying around him. So let's go ahead and get started in creating this image. So, walking out of my kitchen into my living room, incredibly neat and tidy place I've got. So being lit from behind. So I know from the background image that I've got the sun behind me to the left. So I'm trying to recreate that. Also trying to block out the sunlight from this window. The Venetian blinds were not working. So trying to control the light in capturing this initial image of myself. So I'm going to use the pen tool to cut me out. I'm not going to go over all of the pen tool, but just to show you a little bit. There are quite a few pen tool tutorials online. One little trick, you can hold down Alt or Option on Mac, turns into this little triangle, and you kind of realign your path in using the pen tool. So I'm going to go ahead and just go through a small section, but we will pretend as if I have selected all of me, which I have earlier or before this. So connect that. I'm going to hit Control Enter, get the marching ants. Going to hit Select, Modify, Feather, and I've got a feather of 1. I'm going to try that out. So I'm going to hit my layer mask icon and then zoom in, holding down Alt and then scrolling, just checking out the edge just to see if the edge looks right. So if it doesn't, then just Control Z and then do this exact same thing with a different feathered edge. So I've already cut out myself, did not cut out below like the shin. You can see that edge looking fairly good. You don't want it to be too sharp, don't want it to be too fuzzy. So here is my 1080 by 1080 canvas. I'm going to take my background and drag it into this canvas. Going to hit Control T and resize this so it fits. So I've got that. I'm going to drag this selection of myself walking into that canvas. It's way too big. I'm going to select that and holding down Alt and scrolling just to zoom out. Going to hit Control T and resize myself. So I knew I was going to be up to, somewhere around below my knee in this river, so I didn't bother to select my feet. I'm going to right click on the layer mask and hit Apply Layer Mask. And go back and hitting or selecting my layer. And if you hover over one of the corners, you can rotate after having hit Control T. Command T on Mac. So I should have a little bit of a lean, but I shouldn't be straight up and down, because if I'm in the process of walking, there'd be just a little bit of a lean there. So I've created a layer mask on that image of myself, and using a black brush, I'm going to clean up the bottom of my leg area with a not perfectly sharp brush, just a little bit fuzzy, a little bit soft brush. And reducing just testing this out. I'm going to reduce the size of the brush using the left bracket key on your keyboard. Right will increase it. So you can click, hold down Shift, click again. I'll create a straight line. And hitting Control T again and just trying to figure out the composition. I want, since I'm looking where I'm looking, I want more space right after where I'm looking, or towards in the direction where I'm looking, if that makes sense. I'm going to apply that layer mask, and I'm going to start a series of adjustments. So I've got a curves adjustment, and I have forgotten to clip this. So I'm going to hit this little key right there. It clips this curves adjustment to only affect my layer instead of affecting my layer and the background. So I'm just going to, you can completely bring down the exposure, but I'm going to bring it down just a little bit. So I've got one single light source to my back right. So the front left of me should not be as bright. So what you can do to then, this is the brush at 100%. So using a black brush, you can conceal the adjustment I just made. So I'm going to change it to a super soft brush. And reducing the opacity and flow. And I'm just going to try to very subtly build up the back right of my person to be brighter than the rest. So because there should be quite a bit of a highlight going on, seeing as where the sun is. So super subtle at first. I'm going to create another curves adjustment layer. It'll automatically clip to my layer. And I'm going to bring up the exposure considerably on my entire layer. I'm going to click on the layer mask. Actually, I'm going to label this first. So labeling it something memorable, like bright. So clicking on the layer mask and then hitting Control-I to hide all of what we just did. So then, using a black or white brush, you can conceal or reveal. In this case, using a white brush to, if I were to increase this to 100%, you can see what it's doing, providing that brighter variation of myself. So I'm going to reduce the flow and the opacity. And again, just start trying to build up that highlight, that back right side of myself being brighter, receiving that strong highlight from the sun. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. It's just really the same process of trying to isolate that back right side. I'm going to create another adjustment layer, another curves adjustment. I'm going to bring this way darker. And then going to select it and hit Control-I to conceal all of that. I'm going to label this dark. And with a white brush to reveal what we've just hidden, I'm going to start to try to build up the areas in which should be darker. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. But all of that kind of left front side of myself should be a little bit darker. So there's like a before and after. Again, each layer super subtle. I'm going to create yet another adjustment layer. This is a hue and saturation adjustment level. I'm going to hit colorize and then crank that saturation all the way up. Trying to figure out what is going to look more natural as far as that sun golden yellowy orange type look. So I'm going to hit the layer mask, hit Control I to hide all of that. So if I had a perfectly 100% brush, that's what it would do in creating that super orange look. So reducing the flow opacity, I've got the pen pressure on, and I'm going to start revealing some of what we've just hidden. So revealing some of that sun highlight that should be hitting the back of my head, basically the right side. That's sort of creating a rim light around me, but some of it spilling over into more of like the front right side of myself. So even putting a little bit of a highlight on my left arm where the sun would be coming through. Here you can really see it just subtly being built up on my shorts there. Getting a little bit of the sun hitting me. So I'm going to create yet another curves adjustment layer. It'll automatically clip to only affect me. And I'm going to create another brightness adjustment with this curves. Hit the layer mask, hit Control I to hide all of that. Using a white brush, I'm going to start trying to reveal even more of that highlight. So increasing the opacity and the flow. So you can decide how far to take this. Sometimes you can take this too far where it just doesn't look natural anymore. So clicking on the background image, and I'm going to create an adjustment layer of brightness and contrast. So it feels as if the background image needs a lot more contrast. You're trying to match background with this element that doesn't really belong. You're trying to make it look as if it does belong. Also going to have a brightness contrast adjustment level on myself and trying to further match between myself and the background. So I'm going to hit my layer, select my layer, hit Control J to duplicate it. So for some odd reason, it puts the copy above the original, which it doesn't really matter. It's the exact same thing. I'm just going to relabel these layers to me and then me shadow. It's really a reflection. Mislabeled this. I end up correcting that layer. So I'm going to hit Control T and then right click, flip vertical, drag this down. And you're just trying to create a reflection, very subtle, very minimal reflection that would be in that river water. So if you hold down Control, I think it's Command on Mac, you can get this fine touch, or you can move it without that sort of hesitation that it usually has if you did not have Control pressed. So I'm going to put sometimes you can just do this where you hold down Alt or Option on Mac and click in between the layers to clip, in this case, the hue and saturation layer to only affect the reflection. So I'm going to reduce the brightness. It should be a little bit darker, should also be a little bit desaturated. Also going to apply a blur, so filter, blur, Gaussian blur. And not gonna blur it too much. You can drag that so you can see just how much it's blurring. So you can go too far with it and then it just doesn't look natural, so just a little bit of a blur applied to that reflection. I'm gonna hit a layer mask on that. That's what that symbol looks like. So selected a layer mask on that reflection. And I'm going to get rid of, using a black brush, all of this that shouldn't be there. Shouldn't be any of me in the trees, grass, landscape. I'm just going to have that reflection be isolated to the river water. So you can kind of move beyond where it's supposed to go, knowing you can just then switch to the white brush, which will then put it back in. Maybe reducing the size of the brush with the left bracket tool on the keyboard, making sure I've got a slightly more soft brush, and then trying to carefully work on this kind of organic edge as it goes from the river to that tree line, I guess. And let's see, you can also just reduce the opacity. So I was going to do that anyway. So before clicking on the layer mask with black selected, the super soft brush, I'm going to eliminate some of this so it shouldn't be as prominent. As the further away you get from my leg, it should be fading a little bit. So it should be much more prominent as you get closer to where I'm actually entering the water. So another way in which you can create, a subtle look. So combining all of these little techniques of creating subtlety will increase the realistic look of what you're trying to do. So I've selected the smudge tool. So on the actual layer, got a certain strength, I think 45%. And I'm just going to try to create the look of ripples. Because obviously this is in the water. It shouldn't be like a perfect reflection. There should be some distortion. And so using that smudge tool, you can create the illusion of there being movement in the water. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. I'm going to select the original layer, do a Control J to make a copy of that. I'm going to rename these. So this will be the shadow. So I'm going to hit Control T, right click on myself, and select Flip Vertical. So the same thing I did with the reflection. Hover over one of the corners, I'm going to rotate, and I'm trying to mimic that shadow. There's some tall tree to the left there that's casting the shadow, so we know exactly where our shadow of giant me should be as well. So I'm going to try to move the shadow layer into position and then hover over one of the corners to rotate it to try to mimic that shadow that's in the actual background. So you can do this where you then increase the length, but if you want to do this, you hold down Control, Command on Mac, and drag just one of the points, because what I want to do is elongate the shadow, and also do the same thing with the width. Try to reduce the width. So in holding down Control, I can reduce the width without messing with the length. So I'm going to put a hue and saturation, going to clip it to only affect the shadow. And just basically take the lightness all the way down. And we'll mess with the opacity to also create another layer. So I held down Control and then hit New Layer, that New Layer icon. That puts it underneath, in this case, the shadow. So this I've labeled just more shadow. And I'm going to try to mimic the look and the edge of that shadow. So you can select that color, but I know it's black, so you can also just select a black color. And I've cranked up the opacity, so I'm trying to simulate that edge, so I know that I've got to increase the sharpness of that edge. We'll wind up blurring both of them together, but just so that I've got as close of a look as possible. So that looks fairly accurate. And I'm just going to extend these legs. And so they will not look quite right, but they're supposed to be kind of skewed a little bit anyway, because they're elongated and, you know, kind of squished. So you can kind of get away with a lot in doing this and not having to have it look as accurate, I guess. Because it's so early in the day, the shadows are so elongated and I guess different than what they would be if it was like high noon. So I'm going to select the shadow, the more shadow, and the adjustment layer to make the original shadow black, and then hit Control E to merge those layers. So now it's just one layer. I'm going to relabel this Me Shadow. And you can go up to Edit and then Puppet Warp. And I'm going to start putting all of these pins in here. And again, it looks a little wonky, but the shadow will be the opacity. I'll bring down the opacity so much and then blur it that all of these little odd imperfections will not look as bad as they do right now. Plus, you can always get in there by applying a layer mask and erasing like that weird hump towards the top there with my left leg as far as the shadow. So I'm going to click on that, create a layer mask on the shadow area. So using a black brush, I can erase some of this. So I can kind of clean up these edges, make them look a little less odd, like that. And then also do the exact same thing with the other shadow of the leg. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit. Also putting a little bit more space in between the legs. And I'm going to get rid of the shadow that is going beyond the river water. So I don't want this into the trees. It'll also push the shadow back into that space if the trees are in front of the shadow. So I've selected a soft brush, and just like I did with the reflection, I'm going to go beyond what I want, go back in with a white brush, which will reestablish some of that shadow. So with a soft brush here, trying to work with this kind of complex edge of the tree line, and going in and just kind of hitting some of these spots where you should be able to see through the trees at the shadow. I'm going to reduce the opacity a little bit. So it's starting to look a little bit better, a little bit more realistic. So I'm going to hit Filter, Blur, and Gaussian Blur. And so I'm trying to, in a sense, mimic that shadow that you can see right above where that is, where there's some tall tree to the left that's casting this super long shadow. So however sharp or blurry that shadow is, I'm trying to mimic that. So selecting the layer mask of the shadow. I'm gonna make sure that I've got a super soft brush. Save this. So I've selected a black brush, so it'll erase if I had it on 100%, but I'm gonna select the pen pressure and reduce the opacity and flow. So with the super fuzzy soft brush, I'm going to try to diminish the shadow as it gets further away from me. So if you look at that shadow above where the tree is casting that shadow, it starts to diminish the further away it gets to the right. So you can also go back in and puppet warp, because I noticed I want this shadow of my hand to be a little bit more visible if it's in like the middle where you can see a little bit more contrast. You can just do this where that to me is a lot more visible, a lot more prominent to be able to see that shadow of the hand. So then going on the layer mask, clicking the layer mask and then using a black brush with a super subtle opacity and flow and pen pressure to try and erase some of this. So you can reduce the opacity to nothing and just kind of creep it up towards the right, see what looks right. So I've created a new layer on top. This will be the ripples or splashes. And I'm going to zoom in because there should be some sort of white water, white rapids where I've got, the contact of me being in that river. So I'm going to select this super bright orange of the water. I'm going to click on that color and select a much brighter version, but I'm not going to go all the way to the left and choose white. I'm going to have it be right around there. So it's in the ballpark of the color scheme of, where that background image is. And I'm just going to try to start trial and error creating this contact white foam ripples of what should be there as my sharp shins knife through that water. So this is something that Zoomed in, it doesn't look too good, but zoomed all the way out, it starts to look a little bit more believable. And especially getting that pen pressure going. If you don't have a pen and tablet, you can just work this effect with reducing the opacity. So you're trying to apply a completely uneven amount of these ripples, as far as some of them will be like super opaque, almost white. Others will be just a little bit more faint, a little more gray. So the more complexity you can have, and of course like leaving gaps. So creating some splashes. I'm going to undo that one. So there should be some sort of like movement, splashing happening if in fact I am in the process of like moving and walking through this river. So creating this, going to do this for both legs, but again, trying to have it uneven, so it's asymmetrical, trying to create some little tiny splashes. So, and then occasionally zooming out to see, like, is this really visible? Is this too small? Am I wasting my time? Is this working? So I'm going to select the background layer, going to hit Control C, select the top layer and hit Control V. So I've just pasted the background on top of everything. Going to hit a layer mask on that layer that's on top of everything. Going to hit Control I to invert it. So I'm hiding everything on that layer. And then if I had a white brush, increase the size of the brush with the right bracket tool on the keyboard. That's what that would do, but I want to do it in a way more subtle way. So the idea here is to try to get that cloud that's so low in the sky to be in front of me, or at least part of it. So this will obviously help sell the idea that I'm in that space. So this is a good way to just use that background image, hide all of it, and then just reveal a little bit of it using the power of the layer mask. So using a white brush, because white will reveal what I've just hidden. And I did try to use a cloud brush that I made, and it just didn't look right. So I'm just using a super soft, small brush to try to mimic that kind of clumpy, fluffy look of how that cloud is coming across. So you can always go back and switch to your black brush to conceal some of that. Like if you wanted to have your arm a little bit more visible, you can go back and forth all day with switching to the white brush, switching to the black brush. And then using a super small brush, trying to create some like wispy, fluffy, smaller indications of detail of that cloud. So what I've done here is pasted a couple of layers of birds. So I'm not going to go over how to select or isolate birds. Several tutorials out there to be able to do that, but clicking on each layer and hitting Control T to bring these into or where I want them to be. So I'm trying to create some contrast, so I want them in that kind of blue area because the birds are black. But this will just add to the I guess the scale and trying to suggest how big I am with these small birds around me. So creating some new layers, one that will be called orange, where you can select the brightest orange in the scene and then move towards slightly more saturated color, but it's very similar because you selected the color that's actually in the background. So on a new layer, making sure I've got a soft brush, and so if I had 100% opacity, no pen pressure, that's what it would look like. But adding the pen pressure and reducing the opacity. And this is just if you want to try to make the colors a little more punchy. So trying to put a little bit more of that orange here and there. Obviously just, later being able to reduce the opacity of that. Super subtle, but one way of creating kind of a color enhancement. Plus these are complementary colors, this orange and blue, to try to have this right next to each other. It just works. They're opposite on the color wheel, and so I'm creating another layer on top of everything. This will be called blue. So doing the exact same thing, selecting this blue that is in that background image, going to the color and selecting a slightly more saturated blue, and then with the soft brush, in a very subtle way, trying to enhance that blue just a little bit. And if you think you've gone too far, you can always just reduce the opacity. All right, and there you have it. Giant walking through a river on his way downtown anywhere. So be sure and check out the rest of the videos on the channel. And thank you for watching.